It started, as so many things do, with a photograph. Not a painting, not a dream, a photograph posted at 7:43 on a Tuesday morning, bathed in the kind of golden Miami light that doesn't apologize for itself. Grace Oduya stood on the upper deck of a 180-foot super yacht, wearing a cream Missoni sundress that probably cost more than Annette's car payment, her bare arms thrown open to the Atlantic horizon like she was receiving a personal blessing from God. The caption read simply, "She who dares." 42,000 likes in under an hour. Annette Nakamura had stared at that photograph for 6 minutes in the break room of Pinnacle Media Group on Brickell Avenue, her lukewarm oat milk latte growing colder in her hand. 6 minutes. She had timed it later, in the way you time things when you are trying to understand your own damage. They had been friends since age 19, since a cramped shared dormitory room at Florida International University, where they had split ramen packets and argued about lipstick shades and sworn they would change the world. Together. 15 years. And somewhere in those 15 years, Grace had stepped into a different atmosphere entirely, and Annette had remained firmly, suffocatingly, on the ground. Grace drove a matte black Range Rover. She had a penthouse in Edgewater with floor-to-ceiling glass and a saltwater infinity pool that reflected the bay. She attended galas not because she was invited, though she always was, but because the galas, people said, were better when Grace was in them. And now, apparently, she spent her weekends on a super yacht belonging to one Dominic Harrington, whose name Annette had only ever seen printed in Forbes, and once, memorably, in a breathless Miami Herald profile headlined, "The Quiet Billionaire Who Owns the Sea." Annette had never been told about the yacht. That was the detail that settled into her chest like a stone. Not that Grace had gone, but that Grace had not told her. They had spoken on the phone 4 days prior. Grace had said the weekend was quiet, had laughed about ordering takeout, and all the while, she had been stepping aboard a vessel that cost more than most people would earn in 100 lifetimes, wearing a Missoni dress with her arms spread wide. Annette had begun to dig. That was the only honest word for what she did in the weeks that followed. She searched Times Dominic Harrington Yacht Miami Times and found glossy pages from Rob Report. She searched Times Grace Oduya Harrington Times and found nothing which told her everything. The connection between them existed somewhere private, somewhere carefully curated to stay off record. She traced Grace's tagged locations. A restaurant in Coconut Grove she could not afford. A resort in the Bahamas, tagged simply as The Blues. A rooftop bar in Brickell where the cocktails cost $40 and the view cost your soul. It was Annette's colleague, a razor-sharp digital researcher named Priya Desai, who let slip the figure without meaning to during a lunch conversation about a maritime logistics piece she was editing. Harrington Maritime Ventures was valued at $4.3 billion. Dominic Harrington had bought his first yacht at 31, his second at 38, and his third, the Times Azure Crown, 180 feet, built in the Netherlands, crewed by 11 just the previous year. He was divorced, no children, notoriously private, notoriously charming. Priya had laughed as she said it. Annette had not laughed. She had folded the information quietly into herself and carried it home like evidence. When Annette had finally confronted Grace over coffee at a Wynwood cafe gently, she had thought, tactfully, Grace had smiled the particular smile that beautiful women deploy when they are managing someone else's discomfort, and said simply, "It's complicated, Nettie. He's a friend. I didn't want it to be a whole thing." She was wearing olive linen wide-leg trousers and a silk cami in pale gold. Her nails were done in quiet almond. She looked, Annette had thought, like a woman who had never been tired. The lie, and it was a lie, though Grace did not seem to know it was not in what she said. It was in what she did not say. She did not say that Dominic had taken her to Paris in February for what he described as a business trip. She did not say that the Edgewater penthouse was registered under a shell company connected to Harrington Maritime Holdings. She did not say that the Range Rover had been a birthday gift. And then Grace had leaned across the table, touched Annette's hand with warm fingers, and said, "Come on the cruise." Next weekend, Dominic's hosting a small group, 12 people, maybe 15, the Azure Crown. We'll go to the Keys, drink something obscene, and you'll see, it's just a boat, Nettie. It's just a really big boat. She had laughed. Annette had laughed too. And somewhere in the marrow of her, something had shifted, something that felt, God help her, like opportunity. The Times Azure Crown Times had left Bayside Marina at 9:15 on a Saturday morning, under a sky so blue it almost seemed constructed. Annette had worn a white halter-neck sundress from Zara that she had purchased 3 days prior and ironed twice. She had stood on the dock watching Grace descend the gangplank to meet her, wearing a coral Zimmermann wrap dress and oversized Celine sunglasses, and the gulf between them had never felt more physical. The other guests were architects, tech founders, a singer whose face Annette half recognized from a streaming ad, and a pair of Scandinavian investors who spoke rarely and smiled privately at everything, as though they shared a joke the rest of the world hadn't been told. The crew of the Times Azure Crown Times moved around them like a well-rehearsed ballet trays of chilled ceviche, champagne that tasted faintly of pear and stone, a bar stocked with things Annette had only seen in hotel lobbies. The main salon was done in cream leather and pale teak, with custom art pieces commissioned in Lisbon. And there, finally, was Dominic Harrington. He was taller than she expected. He wore cream linen trousers and a pale blue open-collar shirt with the particular casualness of a man who has nothing to prove to any room he enters. His hair was silver at the temples, dark at the crown. His eyes were grey and completely unhurried. He shook Annette's hand and said, "Grace has told me about you, the sharp one." He said it lightly, the way powerful men sometimes signal that they have been watching all along. What happened between the marina and the Keys was not dramatic, not in the cinematic sense. There were no raised voices, no scenes. What happened was quieter and more irreversible than that. Annette had found herself alone with Dominic on the foredeck at 2 p.m., while the others lounged at the stern, and he had asked her about her work with the precision of a man accustomed to evaluating things quickly, what she made, what she wanted, where she thought her ceiling was. And when she had answered honestly, more honestly than she had intended, he had looked at her for a long moment and said, "Someone like you shouldn't have a ceiling." Then Grace had appeared around the corner with 2 glasses of champagne and a smile bright enough to light the whole Atlantic. And the moment had dissolved. But it had happened. Annette had felt it happen. The truth had come in layers, the way truth usually does. The first layer came from Priya, who had found a property deed filed in Miami-Dade County showing the Edgewater penthouse transferred to a trust under Grace's name in November 2023. The legal fingerprints of Dominic Harrington's primary holding company everywhere in the documentation. The second layer came from a woman named Celeste Moreau, a former Harrington executive assistant who, over coffee in a nondescript Brickell cafe, told Annette something she had not expected. Grace had not simply been Dominic's girlfriend. She had, for the past 8 months, been quietly onboarded as a stakeholder in a new hospitality venture. Her name on the paperwork, her social media reached the mechanism, her luminous public image the product. What Grace presented as a romance was also a transaction. But the third layer was the one that undid Annette entirely, because it turned out Dominic had known about her, had looked into her, had asked about her through an intermediary. The foredeck conversation had not been accidental. Nothing Dominic Harrington did was accidental. He had been considering a digital media arm for the venture, and someone had put Annette's name forward. Someone who knew her closely. Someone who had not told her any of this. The someone, of course, was Grace. Dominic had extended a second invitation, a smaller gathering, an evening cruise along Biscayne Bay on the 1st of June, dinner served as the sun dropped behind the Coral Gables tree line. Annette had accepted. She had known by then the architecture of what she was walking into. On the evening cruise, over a dinner of sea bass and cold rosé, she had privately told Dominic that she was interested in the role, in the venture, but that she believed the terms being offered to Grace were structured to limit her equity in ways Grace had not been advised to scrutinize. She had said it levelly, precisely, using the language of someone who had read the documents carefully. And she had watched Dominic watch her, his grey eyes appraising, something shifting in the corners of them. Marcus Webb, his chief of security, seated quietly at the far end of the table, had set down his fork. What Annette had told herself, in those weeks, was that she was protecting Grace, that she was exposing a man who had turned a friendship into an instrument, and there was truth in that. Dominic Harrington had structured Grace's terms to limit her long-term equity. The venture would have made Grace famous on his timeline for his returns. Annette had not been wrong, but she had also not been entirely right, because she had not told Grace first. She had not sat across from her in that Wynwood cafe and said, "I found the documents. I read the terms. You're being managed, and I want you to know." She had gone to Dominic instead. She had used the information as currency. The fallout was swift and irreversible. Dominic restructured the deal, not out of conscience, but because a vulnerability had been exposed and he was too careful a man to leave it unaddressed. Grace was informed of the changes through her solicitor. She eventually, painstakingly, traced the thread back to Annette. Not through confrontation. Grace was not built for confrontation, but through a slow, quiet withdrawal that was worse than any argument. Phone calls returned days late, then not at all. An Instagram unfollow that Annette noticed at 11 p.m. on a Thursday and stared at for a long time. A mutual friend who said, carefully, "Grace is just going through something." Annette had been offered the media role. She had turned it down, never entirely sure whether she did so because she understood what it had cost to obtain, or because accepting it would have required her to look at herself in a way she was not yet ready to do. The role was filled 6 months later by a woman from Atlanta, and the venture launched to considerable success, and Grace Aduya's name appeared nowhere in the press coverage. Dominic Harrington was photographed at the launch event, looking exactly the same as he had on the foredeck of the Times Azure Crown Times, unhurried, silver-templed, and entirely alone with whatever he knew. The last time Annette saw Grace was at a gallery opening in Wynwood, 8 months after the cruise. Grace was across the room in a midnight blue Saint Laurent dress, laughing at something a man in glasses was saying. She glanced up once. Their eyes met. Grace did not look away, she simply looked, fully and clearly, the way you look at someone when there is nothing left to hide or protect. Then she turned back and laughed again. Annette had left the gallery at 9:47 p.m. and sat in her car on NW 2nd Avenue for 11 minutes without starting the engine. Outside, Miami pulsed around her, the neon and the salt air and the low thrum of music from somewhere 2 blocks away, indifferent and magnificent and entirely ongoing. She thought about what she had wanted and what she had done with that wanting, and whether those two things would ever fully separate themselves in her memory into something she could understand and live with. She started the engine. She drove home through the Brickell grid, past the towers with their lit windows and the bay water, catching the last of the city light. She told herself, for the 111th time, that she had not done it for revenge. She told herself she had done it for justice. The truth, which she was not yet ready for, was simpler and heavier than either. She had done it because Grace had had something Annette wanted, and the wanting had become, quietly and over years, a kind of grief, and grief, left long enough without air, has a way of turning into something that acts in the dark. She had not set out to destroy Grace's deal. She had not set out to position herself. She had set out, 15 years ago, for the same horizon. Grace seemed always to be sailing toward, and somewhere along the way, she had mistaken the boat for the destination, and the friend for the distance. The Azure Crown was spotted off the Bahamas that December, cutting north through a flat indigo sea. No one was photographed on the upper deck. No caption was posted. The water, as always, kept its own counsel.